Walter said it in front of her. "You're useless now, Evelyn," he said. "I'm growing into my life. You're shrinking into yours. It's time to accept the reality of that." Brianna was standing 3 feet behind him. She didn't flinch. She didn't look away. She simply held her coffee cup in both hands and watched me, the way a woman watches something she believes she has already won. I didn't argue. I didn't cry. I smiled, the way you smile when you know something the other person doesn't. Then I turned, walked to the kitchen table, opened my laptop, and typed 7 words into an email. I pressed send. 45 minutes later, Walter's phone rang from the bank. And in that moment, everything began to change. Before we go further, if stories like this speak to something deep inside you, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. And I want to ask you something personal. Where are you watching from tonight? And what time is it where you are? Leave it in the comments. Sometimes, knowing that someone else is listening in the dark makes all the difference in the world. The strange thing about a man who stops loving you is that he rarely announces it. He doesn't sit you down and speak plainly. He doesn't hand you a letter or look you in the eye and tell the truth. He simply begins rewriting the story, quietly, methodically, one small revision at a time. And he hopes with everything in him that you won't notice until the rewriting is done. Walter James Carter had been rewriting our story for nearly 2 years before I finally understood what he was building. And by the time I understood it, he believed the ending was already written. He was wrong. My name is Evelyn May Carter. I am 67 years old. I spent 35 years teaching 2nd grade at Fairview Elementary School on the east side of Atlanta, Georgia. 35 years of small chairs and spelling tests, and children who cried on the first day of school and clung to your hand like you were the only solid thing in the world. I retired at 62, the same year Walter sold his construction firm. We had planned it that way, both stepping back at roughly the same time, both easing into what we imagined retirement would look like. Sunday mornings at Greater Hope AME. Grandchildren on the weekends. A garden I finally had time to tend properly. Walter puttering around the garage with his blueprints and his coffee thermos, designing things for the pleasure of it rather than for profit. That was the life we had planned. For 38 years, Walter James Carter had been the kind of man other people described as careful. He had grown up in Macon, the youngest of 4 boys, in a household where money was discussed practically and without embarrassment. His father had been a postal worker who owned 3 rental properties by the time he retired, a fact Walter mentioned more than once when explaining why he believed in documentation. A verbal agreement dies with the man who made it, his father used to say. Walter had carried that belief into every corner of our marriage. He was an engineer by profession and a planner by temperament. He built bridges for Fulton County for 21 years. And then, at 48, he leveraged our savings and a small business loan into Carter Construction Group, a firm that eventually employed 14 people and built a quiet, solid reputation for commercial renovation work across the metro area. I supported that decision completely. We tightened our budget for 3 years while the firm found its footing. I took on extra tutoring in the evenings to help with the shortfall. We did not take a vacation for 2 full years. When the firm finally turned its first real profit, Walter came home and held me in the kitchen for a long moment without saying anything at all. That was the man I married. He had his faults, as all men do. He could be stubborn past the point of reason. He was sometimes too proud to ask for help when help was exactly what was needed. But he was honest. Or I believed he was honest. For most of our marriage, I believed that completely. We have 2 children. Gerald, our son, is 42 years old. He works in logistics management in Decatur and has always been more like his father than he would care to admit. Ambitious, careful with money, and sometimes too quiet when he should speak. Our daughter Denise is 39, lives in Charlotte, and has her grandmother's gift for calling exactly when you need her. Between them, we have 3 grandchildren. The youngest is Amara, Denise's little girl, 8 years old, with her mother's eyes and an old woman's instinct for saying the true thing at exactly the right moment. Walter retired from active management of the firm at 68. He sold the business to a larger regional contractor, which was the right financial decision. What he chose to do with the proceeds of that sale, and what he chose to do with the freedom retirement gave him, those decisions would take 2 years to fully reveal themselves. Brianna Cole appeared in our life in the guise of a business contact. She had been consulting for the regional contractor who purchased Carter Construction, and Walter met her during the transition period. She was 38 years old and described herself as a business development consultant, a title that always struck me as deliberately vague. She was sharp-looking, efficient in the way of someone who has spent years making impressions in rooms full of important men. She wore her hair in a way that said she knew exactly what it meant to walk into a room. Walter mentioned her first in passing, a contact at the new firm, someone he was helping with the transition documentation. Then she became a colleague. Then she became a constant thread in his schedule. Lunches, phone calls, meetings at the small office he maintained downtown, even after the sale. I noted the frequency. I did not yet understand the pattern. 15 years earlier, when Walter was still very much that careful, meticulous man, the one who organized file folders by month and year, who read every insurance policy before signing it, who once spent 3 evenings reviewing the terms of a home equity line we never ended up using, he had sat me down at the kitchen table on a quiet Saturday morning in October. "I've been working with Hastings," he said. James Hastings was our estate attorney, a silver-haired man Walter had used for business matters going back to the early days of the firm. "I've reorganized everything. The trust, the accounts, the property titles. I want you to understand what we have." I remember looking at the folder he placed in front of me and feeling the particular impatience I always felt when Walter entered what I privately called his documentation mode. I trusted him completely. The details felt like his territory, not mine. "Walter," I said, "I trust you to handle it." He looked at me for a moment with an expression I couldn't quite read. "I know you do," he said, "but I want you to understand something." He put one hand flat on the folder. "Paperwork matters, Ev, especially when people say they'll handle it for you." Then he said something else. He said it the way a man says something he hopes will stick, the way you say something to someone you love and want to protect even from the parts of the world you can't see yet. "If anything ever feels wrong, even if I am the one who's wrong, call Mr. Hastings first. Before you do anything else, promise me." I laughed a little. I told him he was being dramatic. He smiled and let the subject go. But he had not been dramatic. He had been precise. And 15 years later, standing in my own kitchen with Brianna Cole 3 feet behind my husband while he told me I was useless, I finally understood exactly why Walter had asked me to make that promise. He had known, even then, that people change, that pressure changes them, that pride changes them, that the wrong person at the wrong moment can change a careful man into something unrecognizable. He had built a protection into our life not because he distrusted himself in that particular moment, but because he was wise enough to know that he might not always be the man he was. The painful thing, the thing that still catches me sometimes like a splinter you can't quite reach, is that the protection Walter built to save me from the world ended up saving me from Walter himself. At first, the changes were so small I convinced myself they meant nothing. That is the dangerous thing about quiet disrespect. It grows in tiny pieces. A tone here, a shifted object there, a sentence delivered so gently it could be interpreted 2 different ways if you tried hard enough. When Brianna first began appearing at the house, I told myself it was professional. Walter was still helping the new firm with transition matters. Of course there were meetings. Of course there were phone calls. Of course, I was determined to be gracious. That was the word I used with myself. Gracious. I offered Brianna coffee when she came to the house. I asked polite questions about her work. She answered in the smooth, rehearsed way of someone who has perfected the performance of warmth without any of the substance behind it. The first sign came on a Tuesday afternoon in March. I was in the sitting room reading when I heard the sound of cabinet doors. Opening, closing, opening again. The kind of sound that means someone is looking for something or rearranging something, and neither option is something a guest should be doing in your kitchen. I walked in. Brianna was standing at the counter with her back to me, moving the jars on my spice rack into a new configuration. She had grouped them alphabetically by the look of it. My spice rack, which I had organized by frequency of use for the better part of a decade, with the paprika and the garlic salt and the smoked cumin, all exactly where my hands expected them in the dark. She turned when she heard me, and her smile arrived instantly. The kind that is ready before the moment requires it. "I hope you don't mind," she said lightly. "I find it easier to think when things have a clear order." Before I could respond, she lifted the lid on the pot I had left simmering on the back burner. She took one slow, deliberate breath through her nose. Then she set the lid back down and smiled again. "Oh," she said, "is that what you're making? That's so—" She paused, just long enough for the pause to mean something. "Homey." The word landed precisely the way she intended it to land. Not as a compliment, as a category. As a way of placing me, gently and permanently, on the correct shelf. She picked up her coffee cup and walked out of the kitchen toward Walter's study. I stood there for a moment looking at my rearranged spice rack. I told myself she was just efficient. Some people have a compulsion for order. It means nothing. I put the paprika back where it belonged and did not say a word about it to anyone. 6 weeks later, Walter's brother Raymond and his wife Cora drove up from Macon for Sunday dinner. I had been looking forward to it. Raymond is a warm man, easy in the way of someone who has never much cared what impression he is making. His wife Cora has been in my life for 31 years. She has sat at my table for holiday meals and helped me address Christmas cards. And once, during the worst year of my marriage, cried with me on the phone for 40 minutes about something I won't name here. We are not close in the way of people who speak every week, but we are honest with each other in the way that matters. I made oxtail stew with rice and peas and a sweet potato pie that took me most of the morning. I had made this meal for Raymond and Cora no fewer than 15 times. It was not an experiment. It was a tradition. Brianna was also at the table. Walter had mentioned the night before that she needed to stop by to go over some documents before the end of the week. He framed it as an inconvenience. He was almost apologetic. She would be in and out quickly. But by the time Raymond and Cora arrived, Brianna had been in the house for 2 hours and showed no sign of leaving, and Walter had set a place for her at the table as easily as breathing. Raymond looked at me when he saw her. Just a brief look, there and gone. He is not a complicated man, but he is not a foolish one. Dinner started warmly enough. Raymond told a long story about a neighbour's dog and a stolen pie that had everyone laughing. Cora asked about Amara's school play. Walter talked about a documentary about infrastructure in East Africa. Then I brought the pot to the table. Brianna leaned forward, her hands folded with great pleasantness, and said, not to me, but to Walter, in the particular tone of someone sharing inside knowledge. Walter, isn't this the dish you mentioned? The one you said you'd been trying to eat lighter versions of because of your blood pressure. You did say that, didn't you? She tilted her head toward him. Walter reached for his water glass and made a sound that was neither confirmation nor denial. I stood with the pot in my hands. Cora looked at me. For 1 full second, Cora looked directly at me across the table. I could see something forming in her expression, something that wanted to speak. Then she reached for the serving spoon and said, "It smells wonderful, Evelyn," in a voice that was trying very hard to fill a gap. She said nothing else. No one said anything else. I served the stew. I sat down. I ate. I told myself Walter had probably mentioned something about his blood pressure at some point, and I probably hadn't been paying close enough attention. It was nothing. But I felt Cora's eyes on me twice more during that meal. And I felt them the way you feel something true that no one is willing to say out loud. I had a routine cardiac follow-up at Emory in April. Nothing alarming. I have monitored a mild arrhythmia for years, and my cardiologist is thorough and careful, someone I trust. The appointment had been scheduled months in advance. Walter knew about it. In earlier years, he had always come with me to these appointments. Lately, he had been too busy. I drove myself. The nurse who checked me in was professional and warm. She took my blood pressure, updated my chart, asked the standard questions about medications and sleep. Then she paused at her screen with the particular hesitation of someone who is choosing their words with great care. "Mrs. Carter," she said, and her voice had dropped into the gentle register people use when they are about to say something that requires gentleness. "Your husband called the clinic this morning." She glanced at the screen. "He mentioned that you'd been, his word was, confused. He said you'd been forgetting things lately. Appointments, he said." She looked at me carefully. "I just want to make sure your file is accurate," she said. Is there someone other than your husband you'd like us to list as your primary emergency contact?" I sat very still on the examination table. The paper covering crinkled when I shifted my weight. The fluorescent light above me buzzed faintly. Outside the window, a car moved through the parking lot below in the slow, unhurried way of hospital parking lots. "My daughter," I said. "Denise." "In Charlotte." The nurse wrote it down without comment. I drove home through Atlanta traffic with both hands on the wheel and did not allow myself to think about what that phone call meant. The one Walter had made before my appointment. The one designed to leave a notation in my clinical file. Until I was safely inside the house with the door closed behind me. Then I sat on the edge of the bed for a very long time. I told myself there must be an explanation. Walter was probably trying to be thorough. He worried about me. He was doing what concerned husbands do. I made myself believe that for 11 more days. Before my father passed, he had left me a small inheritance. Not a large sum by any standard, but it was mine, established in my name alone before the marriage, in an account I had maintained quietly for 30 years. It was not something Walter and I discussed often. It simply existed, the way certain things simply exist in long marriages, understood without being named. I received paper statements every month. The statements stopped arriving in February. I assumed the postal service had made an error. Then March passed, and April began, and still nothing arrived. One morning I watched from the sitting room window as Walter reached into the mailbox before I could get to it. He brought the mail inside and laid it on the hall table. When I looked through it later, there was nothing addressed to me. I asked him casually whether anything had come from First Consolidated in recent months. "It's handled, Ev," he said, without looking up from his phone. "You don't need to worry about that paperwork." 3 days later, I was emptying the kitchen recycling bin and found it. An envelope. My name printed clearly on the front. The return address of First Consolidated Bank. The envelope had been opened carefully and refolded and placed at the bottom of the bin, beneath a grocery circular and a folded paper towel. I pulled it out. I held it in my hands. Then I put it back. I told myself I must have left it there myself. I had been distracted lately. Walter was probably right that I hadn't been paying close enough attention. That is how quiet disrespect works. It makes you doubt the clearest things you see with your own eyes. It makes you revise your own memory. It makes you smaller and smaller, until you begin to resemble the version of yourself that other people have been describing. Confused, inattentive, not quite aware of what is happening around her. I was not confused. I was being carefully made to feel confused. Those are two entirely different things. But it took me a little while longer to understand the distinction fully. The photograph had hung above the mantel for 22 years. It was taken at our 25th anniversary dinner, a restaurant Walter had booked 3 months in advance, a night when he wore his good charcoal suit and I wore the deep green dress that Denise had helped me find in Buckhead the week before. The frame was dark mahogany. In the photograph, Walter has his hand at the small of my back, and we are both mid-laugh at something the photographer had said. And we look like two people who belong in each other's presence. Not perfectly, not without history, but genuinely. I came downstairs one Thursday morning in May to find a landscape print hanging in its place. Rolling hills, a generic blue sky, the kind of thing you find in the waiting rooms of dental offices or the corridors of mid-range hotels. Walter was in the kitchen. I stood in the doorway of the living room for a long moment, looking at the unfamiliar print where my marriage had lived for 22 years. "Walter," I said quietly. He came to the doorway. "Where is the anniversary photograph?" He glanced at the wall with the expression of someone who has already moved on from a decision and finds it slightly inconvenient to revisit it. "Brianna felt the living room needed freshening," he said. "It was looking dated." Then he walked back to the kitchen. Amara was staying with us that weekend. She came downstairs 20 minutes later, still in her pajamas, her braids loose from sleep, the wooden beads at the ends clicking softly as she moved. She stopped in front of the mantel and looked at the landscape print for a moment, with the particular frown that 8-year-olds deploy when the world has arranged itself incorrectly. "Grandma," she said, "where did the picture of you and Grandpa go?" I looked at the empty space above the mantel. I thought about a 25th anniversary and a green dress, and a man who once held me in a kitchen without saying a single word, because some things don't require words. "We're having it cleaned," I said. Amara considered this with the seriousness it apparently deserved. Then she went to find her cereal. And I stood in the living room alone, in the particular quiet of a house that has just told you something it could not say directly. Quiet disrespect grows in tiny pieces. And sometimes the people placing those pieces don't even bother to watch them fall. I had told myself through each of these moments that I was imagining things. I had talked myself back from the edge of understanding again and again, because understanding would have required action, and action would have required a kind of courage I had not yet gathered. I was patient past the point where patience was wisdom. I was careful past the point where care protected me. And all the while, the quiet disrespect was growing. But there is one more thing I have not yet told you. A moment that happened between the photograph and everything that followed. I was coming down the stairs one evening, moving quietly in my house shoes on the hardwood steps, when I heard voices in Walter's study below. The door was not fully closed. I could hear Brianna's voice, low and certain, the voice of a woman accustomed to being believed in rooms where she speaks. "She's comfortable, Walter," she said. "Comfortable people don't ask questions." I stood on the fourth step from the bottom. I did not hear Walter's response. I don't know if he made one. I stood there for a moment longer than I should have, and then I moved past the door without a sound. And I went to the kitchen, and I put the kettle on, and I waited for the water to boil. I repeated her words in my mind, slowly, the way you turn a stone in your hand to examine each face of it. Comfortable people don't ask questions. I had been comfortable. That was absolutely true. But something in that sentence had shifted something in me. A small, precise shift, like a gear catching. Because I am a school teacher, and the one thing 35 years of watching children learn had taught me is this: the moment you decide you already know what someone understands, you have made yourself vulnerable to everything they might discover. I was not asleep. I was simply not yet fully awake. That was about to change. Amara stayed with us the second weekend in June. Denise drove up from Charlotte on Friday evening and left early Saturday morning for a conference, which meant Amara had 2 days with her grandmother in the house that smelled like magnolia hand cream and the sweetness of a home that has never been in a hurry. We braided her hair on Saturday morning at the kitchen table. 4 long braids with wooden beads at the ends that clicked together when she turned her head. Amara was specific about the tension. Too tight and she winced. Too loose and she declared it messy. We negotiated. We always negotiate. It is one of my favourite things about her. We made peanut butter cookies in the afternoon, and Amara was very serious about the fork-press design on each one, insisting that the lines run perfectly parallel. She would hold each cookie up to the light to check before it went onto the tray. She was her grandfather's granddaughter in that way, the old Walter, the careful Walter, and it made my chest ache with a tenderness I didn't have words for. Saturday night, I tucked her into the guest bed, the room that had been Gerald's when he was small, where I painted the trim a soft yellow 30 years ago and never changed it. Amara had her stuffed elephant under one arm and was already drifting when she said it. She said it in the loose, unguarded way children speak when they are between waking and sleeping, when the usual filters have gone soft and the words come out exactly as they were heard. "Daddy said you're going to get a smaller house soon, Grandma." I kept my hand moving slowly over her hair. "He said it would be better for your health," she continued. Her eyes were nearly closed. "He said it would be easier." "Is that right?" I said. My voice came out even and unhurried, which surprised me because my chest had tightened like a fist. Mm-hmm. A long pause. I told him I liked your house. He said you'd be okay. That's sweet of you to say. A breath. That does sound like it could be nice, doesn't it? A smaller house. Amara made a small sound of sleepy agreement. Within 2 minutes, she was fully asleep. I sat in the chair by the window for a long time after her breathing steadied. A smaller house. Better for your health. Easier. Those were not the words of a husband being solicitous about his wife's well-being. Those were the words of a man who had already discussed something with his son. Something he had not yet said to his wife. Which meant the conversation had already happened. Which meant there was a plan in motion that Walter had chosen to share with Gerald and with no one else. I went back to my bedroom and lay down in the dark. I told myself, for the last time, that there might be an explanation. The next morning, while Amara was watching television in the sitting room, I did Walter's laundry. I had been doing it since habit outlived the feeling behind it. One of those small domestic routines that outlast the love that once animated them. In the breast pocket of his grey jacket, the jacket he had worn to a business lunch the week before, I found a business card. I held it near the window to read it. Carmichael and Reeve, attorneys at law. Asset division and estate restructuring. By appointment only. Below that, handwritten in blue ink, a date 2 weeks from now, and an initial. B. I stood at the window for a long moment. The morning light came through the curtains in thin, parallel lines that fell across the card in my hand, and I thought about a spice rack, moved without permission, and a Sunday pot of oxtail stew, challenged by a woman who had not earned the right to challenge it, and a nurse who had been called before my appointment, and a letter at the bottom of a recycling bin, and my wedding photograph in some box somewhere, being replaced by rolling hills and a stranger's sky. I photographed the card with my phone. Then I put it back in the pocket, exactly as I had found it. I folded the jacket. I placed it on Walter's chair. I walked to the kitchen and made coffee and called Amara in for breakfast and listened to her tell me about a dream involving a talking horse and a very confused librarian. And I laughed at all the right moments. But the card had registered. It had registered the way something registers when it cannot be unfiled. When the mind says, "Here is the thing you were afraid of, and it is real, and now you know." An asset division attorney is not a precaution. An asset division attorney is a plan. And that night, after Denise collected Amara and the house went quiet, I sat in the yellow-trimmed guest room and I heard Walter's own voice from 15 years ago, clear as a struck bell. Call Mr. Hastings first, before you do anything else. Promise me. It was time to keep that promise. I called Mr. Hastings on a Monday morning when Walter had left for his downtown office. I called from the kitchen, which is the room in this house where everything important has always happened. The meals and the arguments and the reconciliations and the quiet conversations that shaped the years of a marriage. I dialed the number from memory because I had looked it up the night before and memorized it deliberately, the way you memorize something you want to be able to reach without leaving a record. The receptionist answered on the second ring. When I said my name, there was a brief pause. Not confusion, but the particular pause of recognition. "Yes, Mrs. Carter," she said. "Mr. Hastings has had your name in mind recently." I did not ask what that meant. I simply asked whether Mr. Hastings had any availability that week. "He can see you this afternoon," she said, "if that works for you." Something about the promptness of that answer, The sense that he had been waiting, perhaps expecting this call, gave me the first real sense of solid ground I had felt in months. James Hastings had his office in a quiet brick building in Midtown Atlanta, tucked between a certified public accountant and a notary service. The kind of building that does not announce itself because the people who come to it already know where it is. Inside, the carpets were the deep burgundy of old institutions. The bookshelves were precise. The air smelled faintly of cedar and paper, which is the smell of a place that takes the long view of things. The receptionist showed me to a small conference room with a window that looked onto a narrow courtyard where a potted cedar grew in a clay pot. Mr. Hastings came in within minutes, silver-haired, unhurried, wearing a dark suit that had been pressed with the care of someone who considers precision a form of respect. He carried a leather folder. He shook my hand with both of his and held it for a moment. "Mrs. Carter," he said, "I'm glad you called." He said it simply, without drama, and sat across from me. "How are you?" "Clearer than I was a month ago," I said. "Which is what concerns me." He opened the folder. What he told me over the next hour rearranged my understanding of my own life the way a lamp rearranges a room that has been dark. Not by adding anything new, but by illuminating what was always there. 15 years ago, when Walter had organized our estate, he had done so with great thoroughness. The Carter Family Trust had been established to protect their combined assets and simplify the eventual question of inheritance. But the trust had been structured around a central fact: the primary family home, the house we have lived in for 31 years, had been purchased partly with the inheritance I received from my late father, Samuel Monroe, who had worked the post office in Birmingham, Alabama, for 34 years, and left me the modest sum he had been careful with his entire working life. That inheritance had gone into the down payment, which meant the house had been titled, on the advice of counsel at the time, in my name alone. "Your name only," Hastings confirmed quietly. "Not joint tenancy, not community property, solely yours." I sat with that for a moment. "Walter is aware of this," Hastings said, "or he was aware of it when the documents were signed. Whether he has chosen to remember it accurately is another matter." Beyond the house, 3 additional assets: a small investment property in Gwinnett County, a savings account established before the marriage, and a portion of the trust corpus connected to the firm's original capitalization, all remained under the Carter Family Trust structure, with me named as primary trustee. Walter held co-trustee authority for routine management, but any transfer or restructuring above a threshold amount required my authorization, in writing, with my signature. "No exceptions. No transfer of that size has been processed without you," Hastings said. "But someone has been inquiring about how to do it," I said. Hastings looked at me carefully. He turned to a section near the back of the folder and laid it on the table between us. "In the past 60 days," he said, "a third-party legal services firm was engaged to research the process of establishing a durable power of attorney for an individual whose spouse claims cognitive impairment." The fluorescent light above me buzzed faintly. Somewhere outside, a car door closed in the courtyard below. "The inquiry referenced a medical contact at a cardiac clinic," Hastings continued, "and cited documentation from the clinic's files suggesting the patient—" "Suggesting I was confused," I said. Hastings nodded. "Yes?" I thought about the nurse's voice, the particular gentleness of it, the question she had asked that was not really a question. "Is there someone other than your husband you'd like listed as your primary emergency contact?" I thought about Walter calling before my appointment. laying the foundation in the clinical record, creating, quietly and in advance, a paper trail suggesting that his wife was too confused to manage her own affairs. Comfortable people don't ask questions. "How serious is this?" I asked. "Serious enough that I sent a certified letter to the third-party firm informing them of your status as primary trustee and the legal requirements for any competency-based POA proceeding." Hastings closed that section of the folder. The letter slowed the process, but it did not stop the planning. He looked at me with the directness of someone who has spent decades telling people things they need to hear. "Mrs. Carter, what is happening here is a structured campaign to establish grounds for removing your legal authority over assets that are, in fact, yours. It has been thought through carefully. It is not impulsive." I heard those words. I let them settle. I did not look away from them because looking away would have been the old Evelyn, the comfortable one, and I had decided I was done being her. "What do I do?" I said. Hastings leaned forward and folded his hands on the leather folder. "Nothing visible. That is the most important thing. Go home. Be present. Be warm. Cook his dinner." He held my eyes. "Let him show you exactly how far he intends to go. And when he makes his move, when he produces a document and asks you to sign it, send me an email." He wrote something on a small notepad and slid it toward me. "Subject line, activate. That is all. I will know exactly what to do." I looked at the notepad. "There is one more thing," Hastings said. He turned to the final pages of the trust agreement and laid them before me. "Walter's own past goodness is written into this document. There is a clause, he included it himself 15 years ago, that activates if the primary trustee has reason to believe the trust is being misused. Upon activation, you assume immediate full administrative control over every account, every property, every asset in the structure." He smoothed the page gently. He built this protection himself. For a moment, I didn't trust myself to speak. The irony of it was almost more than I could hold. Walter had built a protection to keep the world from taking advantage of me. And now that same protection stood directly between him and everything he was trying to take. "He taught me that paperwork matters," I said very quietly. Hastings allowed himself a small smile. He was right about that. I stood to leave. At the door, I stopped and turned back. "Mr. Hastings, has Walter contacted you recently?" "No," he said simply. "He hasn't. He probably assumed you would take his side." Hastings shook his head. "I work for the trust, Mrs. Carter. The trust's primary beneficiary is you. That has never changed." I drove home through the Atlanta afternoon with the windows down. Somewhere on Moreland Avenue, the emotion moved through me. Not tears exactly, but the physical release of something held too long. A long breath from somewhere deep. The loosening of something in my chest I hadn't known was clenched. I was not powerless. I had simply not known what I held. Those are different things. Entirely different things. And now I knew. I came home that evening and made sweet potato pie. Not for any particular reason, except that it is the thing my hands know how to do when my mind needs to be quiet. The smell of it, the cinnamon, the brown sugar, the particular warmth of it coming out of the oven, fills a kitchen with something that feels like safety. I have made that pie for 40 years. Walter used to say he could smell it from the driveway. He came home at 6:30. I had set the table. He looked briefly surprised, pleasantly briefly. "Looks good," he said, and sat down. I asked him about his day. He told me about a meeting with a former colleague. I listened. I passed him the bread. I smiled at the right moments. I was, from every visible angle, the woman he believed he was managing. Inside, I was cataloguing everything. I had begun keeping notes 2 days after I returned from Hastings' office. I wrote them in a small spiral notebook, the narrow kind, blue cover, the size that fits in the back pocket of a Bible, which is exactly where I kept it. On the small table by my reading chair, between my daily devotional and my Bible, in a stack of things that had sat undisturbed in that spot for years. No one in that house was ever going to reach into my Bible. I wrote dates. I wrote what I had observed. I wrote what I had heard. The recycled envelope, the doctor's phone call, Amara's sleepy disclosure, the business card with the initial B and the appointment 2 weeks away, the anniversary photograph removed because the room needed freshening, the moment on the stairs and the sentence about comfortable people. When I wrote them down in sequence, they were not small at all. They formed a picture as clear as anything I had ever seen. Walter's behaviour in the weeks that followed my visit to Hastings became easier to read now that I understood what I was reading. He spoke more often about simplifying the finances, casually at dinner, the way you might mention rearranging a closet. He said things like, "We should update some of the account structures," and "I want to make sure everything is accessible." He said these things lightly, letting them hang in the air unaddressed, and then moved on. He was laying groundwork, softening the arrival of something he intended to formalize. I nodded. I said, "That makes sense, and whatever you think is best." And I watched him hear exactly what he needed to hear. Watched him relax into the confidence of a man whose plan is proceeding without complication. One Tuesday evening, I passed the Home Office on my way to the kitchen. The door was not fully closed. Walter was at his desk with the lamp on, and Brianna was seated across from him with a document in her hands. She was pointing to something near the bottom of the page and speaking in the low, efficient voice she used when she believed she was the most capable person in a room. I caught one phrase through the gap in the door. "Before the end of the month," Brianna said. "Once it's processed, everything simplifies." I continued to the kitchen. I put the kettle on. I went to my chair. I wrote the date in my notebook and the phrase, "before the end of the month." I underlined, "simplifies." A few days later, on a Thursday afternoon, Gerald stopped by. Gerald had his father's way of occupying a room, taking up space without quite knowing what to do with it. He made small talk. He asked how I was sleeping. He looked around the house the way someone looks around a place they are trying to measure. I offered him coffee. He accepted it. We sat at the kitchen table and talked about Amara's school play and a highway project near his office, and I watched my son be careful with me, in the specific way of someone managing a guilty conscience. Brianna arrived 20 minutes after Gerald, which was not a coincidence. She came through the front door with the comfort of someone who does not need to knock, dropped her bag on the hall bench, and said to the room in general, "Traffic on 14 was awful." Then she moved through the hallway past me and said to Gerald, at exactly the volume necessary to be clearly audible, "Your father is so much more himself lately. It's like he's finally living his actual life." Gerald looked at the kitchen table. He said nothing. I watched my son say nothing. I watched him choose the silence of someone who needs to remain in good standing with 2 different people simultaneously. And I thought about what it costs a person to stay quiet in a room where something unjust is being said. I thought about how silence feels like neutrality from the inside when it is actually a decision. And I felt something more complicated than anger toward my son. I felt sad for him, because he was going to have to live with the memory of saying nothing long after this was over. I went to my garden that evening. The irises had bloomed early this year, a deep purple that Walter once said looked like the inside of a church on a good Sunday. I cut 3 stems and brought them inside and put them in the narrow vase on the windowsill above the kitchen sink. Then I sat at the kitchen table and I waited, in the particular way you wait when you know exactly what is coming and have already decided what you will do when it arrives. 3 days later, on a Sunday morning, Walter knocked on the bedroom door. "Evelyn," he said, "I'd like to have dinner tonight. Gerald's coming. I want to talk about some things." "Of course," I said. "I'll cook." He nodded and left. I sat on the edge of the bed for a moment. Just the family. I already knew Brianna would be there. I went to the kitchen, got out the good china, and began to cook. And in my Bible, on the table by my chair, my small blue notebook waited with its quiet and careful record of every deniable thing that had been done to me over 8 months. I was no longer comfortable. I was ready. He had set the table himself. That was the first thing I noticed when I came downstairs that Sunday evening. Walter had set the dining room table, the one reserved for Thanksgiving and Easter, and the kinds of occasions that benefit from being elevated by good china and pressed napkins. The candles were lit, the wine glasses were out. He had folded the napkins into the triangular shape he associated with formality, something he had learned from his mother and deployed perhaps 4 times a year, always for a reason. It was a beautiful table. And it unsettled me, the way beautiful things sometimes do when the beauty is calculated rather than felt. Gerald arrived at 6. He hugged me in the hallway with the careful energy of someone managing his own conscience. Brianna arrived 7 minutes after him, wearing a dark blouse and small gold earrings, looking like someone who had dressed deliberately for an occasion without wanting it to appear that she had. Walter poured wine. We sat. For the first 40 minutes, dinner was a performance. Polite conversation about Gerald's work, a discussion of Amara's upcoming school play, a story Walter told about a former colleague who had retired to the coast of Portugal. Everyone laughed in the right places. I served the food I had cooked: roasted chicken, rice, the soft bread from my mother's recipe, and I passed dishes and refilled glasses and said the things that are said at a dinner table when people are pretending. Brianna complimented the chicken. Her smile was directed at Walter rather than at me. I observed all of it and said very little. I was present in the way of someone who has arrived at a long, anticipated moment after a very long journey and is content to let it come. After the plates were cleared and the table held only glasses and the small fruit bowl I keep in the center for decoration, Walter placed both hands flat on the tablecloth and spoke. "I want to talk about something practical," he said. "About the family finances. About making sure everything is in order as we get older." Gerald looked at his glass. "I've been thinking about simplifying things," Walter continued. He looked at me directly, his voice measured and careful. The voice of a reasonable man presenting a reasonable idea to a reasonable woman who trusts him. Making sure that if anything ever happens to either of us, the transition is smooth and easy to manage. "That makes sense," I said. My voice was perfectly calm. Walter nodded. He reached to the chair beside him, where he had placed a leather document folder before dinner, I now noticed, and opened it. He removed several pages, organized and paper-clipped. He turned them right side up and slid them across the table toward me. I had this drawn up with a legal service, he said. It's a durable power of attorney, standard document. It designates me as the managing authority for household finances and medical decisions in case. He paused and chose the next words with visible care. In case there's ever a period when you're not feeling quite yourself. The table was very quiet. I looked at the document. My name appeared at the top, next to the word grantor. Below, in the section labelled Attorney in Fact, Walter James Carter. Gerald stared at the tablecloth. Brianna held her wineglass in both hands and said nothing, though I could feel her attention on me like a hand pressed against the back of my neck. I picked up the document and turned through the pages. I read slowly. Walter watched me. His patience had a thinness to it, the way the top layer of ice appears solid until you test the weight. I set the document down. I looked at Brianna. I held her gaze for one steady, unhurried moment, long enough for her to understand that I was not looking at her the way she had grown accustomed to being looked at in this house. Then I reached to my right and opened my laptop. Walter frowned. "What are you—" "Just a moment," I said. I opened my email. I typed 7 words into the subject line. I typed 1 word into the body. I pressed send. Then I closed the laptop, folded my hands, and looked across the table. "What was that?" Walter said. "Correspondence," I said pleasantly. Walter gestured toward the document. "Evelyn, the paperwork." "In a moment," I said. "Would anyone like more bread?" Gerald shook his head. Brianna looked at Walter. Walter looked at me. We sat. The candles burned down a 1/4 inch. The fruit bowl sat in the center of the table. Outside, a car passed slowly on the evening street. 17 minutes later, Walter's phone buzzed against the tablecloth. He looked at the screen. Something in his expression shifted. Controlled, managed, but visible to someone who had spent 38 years learning to read that face. "Excuse me for a moment," he said. He walked into the hallway. Gerald looked at me. I looked at Gerald. He opened his mouth slightly, then closed it. Brianna said, "Joan," and then stopped, because she had used the wrong name. My name is Evelyn. Joan was someone else. Someone she must have been speaking about at other times, in other rooms, in conversations I was not meant to hear. "Evelyn," I said pleasantly. "My name is Evelyn," she corrected herself, but the colour had changed in her face. From the hallway I could hear Walter's voice, rising and then dropping, and then going very still. The particular silence of a man receiving information he was not prepared to receive. A question asked in a low voice, then silence again. He returned to the table and sat down. He picked up his wineglass and set it down without drinking. "There seems to be a hold," he said carefully, "on some of the accounts." "Yes," I said. "I know." Walter looked at me. For the first time in months, possibly for the first time in years, he looked at me the way you look at someone you have badly underestimated. With a combination of recognition and something that, in a different man at a different moment, might have become respect. "What did you do?" he said. I reached beside my chair and took my Bible from the small tote bag I had placed there before dinner. I opened it to the back cover and removed the blue spiral notebook. I set it on the table and opened it to the first page. "I'd like to walk you through some dates," I said. Brianna went very still. I read from the notebook in the same measured, unhurried voice I had used for 35 years to read aloud to second graders, clearly without rushing, giving each entry the weight it deserved. February 14th. A letter from First Consolidated Bank found in the kitchen recycling bin. Opened. Refolded. Placed beneath a grocery circular. March 9th. A phone call made to my cardiologist's office prior to my scheduled appointment, resulting in a notation in my medical file suggesting the patient had been experiencing confusion and forgetfulness. The patient being me. April 2nd through April 29th. 6 separate mail collections in which no item addressed to me was delivered to my hands. May 3rd. The anniversary photograph removed from above the mantel. A 22-year installation. Replaced with a landscape print, because the room needed freshening. I paused. I looked at Brianna when I said the next part, not with anger, simply with clarity. May 19th. A business card discovered in a jacket pocket. Carmichael and Reeve, Asset Division attorneys. An appointment dated 2 weeks from that day. Marked with the initial B. The room held its breath. June 2nd. My granddaughter, falling asleep, telling me she'd been informed I would soon be living in a smaller house. For my health. Because it would be easier. The word easier sat in the centre of the table like something with weight. I closed the notebook. Walter, I said quietly, I met with James Hastings 6 days ago. The effect of that name in that room was remarkable to witness. Not like a blow, like cold water, the precise, clarifying kind. He showed me the trust documents, the ones you created 15 years ago, when you were still the man who believed paperwork matters. I touched the document Walter had slid toward me, lightly, with 2 fingers. The house is in my name. It has always been in my name. The trust corpus cannot be transferred without my written authorization. And this power of attorney cannot be established through a claim of cognitive impairment that was built in advance by a phone call to my doctor. Gerald spoke. His voice was very quiet. Dad, he said, what did you do? It was not a question. Walter looked at his son. Something moved across his face. Not guilt exactly, but the expression of a man confronting the distance between who he had imagined himself to be and who he had actually become. Brianna leaned forward with a composed expression and said, Evelyn, I think there may be some misunderstanding about the intent here. I looked at her. I had been waiting for this moment, not with cruelty, not with bitterness, but with the quiet certainty of a woman who has survived something by understanding it from every angle. You told Walter, I said, that comfortable people don't ask questions. She stopped speaking. I heard you on the stairs. I stood on the 4th step, and I heard every word. And you were absolutely right. I held her gaze. I was comfortable. I had been comfortable for a very long time. And comfortable people don't ask questions. A beat. One clean, unhurried beat. Fortunately, I said, I stopped being comfortable. The dining room was absolutely still. Brianna placed her wineglass on the table and did not pick it up again. I turned back to Walter. My voice had not risen once during this conversation. It did not rise now. I'm not a woman who mistakes volume for power. The accounts are frozen, I said. All transfer requests and power of attorney proceedings connected to the Carter Trust have been flagged and placed under review by the primary trustee. That is me. I paused. Mr. Hastings will be in contact with the financial institutions tomorrow morning. Walter said, Evelyn, the document, I continued, I am not signing. Not tonight. Not in any form that resembles this one. I slid it back across the table toward him. If you have genuine concerns about estate planning, we can discuss them with Hastings present. Honestly, the way it should have been done from the beginning. Gerald stood up from the table. He stood the way a person stands when sitting has become impossible, when the room is too much to hold from a chair. He walked to the window and stood with his back to us for a moment. The curtain moved faintly in the air from the vent above. Then he turned around. I knew, he said. His voice was thin. I didn't know everything, but I knew something was being planned and I said nothing about it. He looked at me. Mama, I'm sorry. I looked at my son. In that moment, I could see all the versions of him I had loved. The boy who ran to me when he scraped his knee. The teenager who was too proud to ask for directions. The young man who drove 4 hours to sit with me in a hospital waiting room without my asking. All of those people were still there, underneath the man who had made a wrong choice and would now carry the weight of it. I know, I said. That was all. Brianna gathered her bag from the back of her chair. She said Walter's name once, quietly, with a particular inflection. Not affection exactly, but the sound of someone recalculating. He did not look at her. She walked out of the dining room. I heard the front door open and close. Gerald sat back down, slowly, in the chair across from me. The three of us, Walter, Gerald and I, sat at the table with the good china and the candles burning low, in a quiet that was neither peaceful nor hostile, but honest. The first honest quiet that had been in this house in a very long time. Outside the window, the evening had gone fully dark, and somewhere down the street a dog was barking at something only it could see. Walter looked at the tablecloth for a long time. Then he looked at me. I don't know how to explain what I was thinking, he said. I'm not sure I need you to, I said. He was quiet for another long moment. Then, very slowly, very quietly, he said, Your father's money bought this house. Yes, I said. It did. A silence. I think, Walter said finally, that I had forgotten that. I know, I said. That's what frightened me. Walter moved out 10 days later. There was no scene, no dramatic argument in the hallway, no raised voices in the driveway. He packed 2 suitcases and a box of books on a Thursday morning, while I was in the garden, and when I came inside the house held that specific quality of air it acquires when something has left it. Not empty exactly, but lighter, like a held breath finally released. I did not ask him to leave dramatically. I simply made clear, in a conversation the morning after the Sunday dinner, that the house was mine, the accounts were in my name, and I was no longer able to manage the confusion of living alongside a plan that had been built without me. He could stay, or he could go. But if he stayed, things would need to be different in ways I was not certain he was capable of becoming. He chose to go, and I believe, somewhere underneath the pride and the planning and whatever story he had been telling himself about the shape of his future, he knew it was the right choice. Some people need to lose a thing fully before they understand what it was. The legal proceedings that followed were quiet and methodical, which is how Walter had always conducted his business, and which, in the end, made things somewhat less difficult for both of us than they might have been. Mr. Hastings represented the trust on my behalf. Walter retained his own attorney. The house, the Gwinnett property, and the primary savings accounts remained under the trust structure as they had always been. Walter retained his pension and a portion of the assets that had been genuinely joint throughout the marriage. It was not nothing, but it was not what Brianna had been planning toward. I heard through my cousin Nadine, who still plays bridge on alternate Tuesdays with Walter's former secretary at the firm, that Brianna had moved back to her mother's home in Augusta by September. Once the trust accounts were frozen and the divorce proceedings made clear that nothing in Walter's name could be reached through her plans, she stopped returning his calls entirely. Walter, from what I understand, had to sell the car he was most proud of by November to cover his legal fees. Some men spend decades building something careful and true, and then spend one foolish season trying to burn it all down. I am not glad about any of it. I want to be clear about that. There is no satisfaction in the collapse of a marriage you believed in completely for most of your life. There is no pleasure in watching someone you spent 38 years beside discover, too late, the cost of his own choices. What I feel, if I name it honestly, in the late-night quiet of this house that is mine, is something closer to grief than triumph. The grief of losing someone you thought you knew. The grief of discovering that the man who once told you paperwork matters was, in the end, undone by exactly that. But grief and dignity are not opposites. I have learned that. You can mourn something and still stand straight in the middle of it. You can ache for the life you thought you had and still know, clearly and without confusion, who you are. Gerald and I had a long conversation in August on the back porch over sweet tea and the stillness of a Georgia evening. He told me that he had heard things in the weeks before the Sunday dinner, conversations between his father and Brianna that made him uneasy and afraid. He had told himself it was not his place to interfere. He had told himself his mother was being looked after. He had told himself a great many comfortable things. "I should have called you," he said. "I should have come to you the moment I knew something felt wrong." "Yes," I said. "You should have." He looked at his hands. He has his father's hands, wide palms, long fingers, the kind built to grip something and hold it. "I'm sorry, Mama." "I know you are," I said, "and I forgive you. But Gerald..." I waited until he looked up at me. "Forgiveness doesn't erase what happened. It means I'm not going to carry my portion of it alone. You'll carry yours. That's what forgiveness actually is." He nodded slowly. He understood. And we sat together on the back porch as the sun went down over Atlanta, and I thought about my father, Samuel Monroe, who had worked the post office in Birmingham for 34 years and left me enough money to put a down payment on a front door that no one could take from me. I thought about what it means to be protected by someone who loved you long before you understood what protection was worth. And I thought about how the best gifts are often the ones we don't recognize until the moment we need them most. The irises bloomed again in October. I cut them in the morning, the deep purple ones, and put them in the narrow vase on the windowsill above the kitchen sink. Amara was coming that afternoon. We were going to braid her hair and make the peanut butter cookies with the perfectly parallel fork press lines, and she was going to inspect each one against the light before it went onto the tray. And I was going to love every single minute of it. The house was mine. It had always been mine. And now I knew it all the way through. I want to say one last thing before we part tonight. There is a difference between silence and peace. I spent a long time in this story confusing the two. I was quiet because I believed that quiet was gracious, that patience was love, that overlooking small indignities was the price of keeping a household whole. And quiet can be all of those things. Silence can be chosen, can be powerful, can be its own kind of wisdom. But it can also be something else. It can be the habit of a woman who has been taught that her discomfort matters less than other people's comfort. It can be the trained reflex of someone who has spent so long adjusting herself to the shape of a room that she has forgotten she is allowed to take up space. Never mistake silence for peace. Peace is something you build, with honesty, with knowledge, and with the willingness to ask questions, even when asking questions is uncomfortable. It is not the absence of conflict. It is the presence of dignity, standing in the center of your own life. And sometimes, this is what I most want you to hear tonight, wherever you are. Sometimes, the person who loved you most carefully laid the foundation for your dignity long before you knew you would need it. A trust document signed on a quiet Saturday morning. A name on a property title. A promise extracted over a kitchen table. Call Mr. Hastings first. These are not cold or transactional things. They are love made durable. Love made lasting. Love built to outlast the weakness of any particular season. Paperwork matters. Not because numbers matter more than people, but because love without structure can be dismantled by people who do not share your values. The careful ones understood that. My father understood it. Walter understood it once, and then, in his worst season, forgot. But his past goodness saved me from his present mistake. And there is something in that I am still working out the full shape of. Something that feels, if I am honest, like an unexpected mercy. Not for him, for me. If this story found you tonight, in Atlanta or in Kingston, in London or in Lagos, in Nairobi or in Charlotte, or in a bedroom somewhere with the sound of a sleeping house around you, I would like to know you were here. Leave me a comment. Tell me where you're watching from. Tell me what time it is where you are. And if you've ever had to protect your own dignity from someone who once promised to protect it for you, tell me that too. Every one of you who has ever sat in a quiet room knowing something was wrong and told yourself you were imagining it, you were not imagining it. You were simply not yet ready. And when you were ready, you were more than enough. If this story spoke to you, please like the video and subscribe to the channel. There are many more stories here, about family, about love, about the particular courage of women who have been underestimated and found their way through anyway. Thank you for listening, and remember, paperwork matters. He taught me that himself. I am simply reminding you he was right.